A scream shatters the elegance of Ashwood Grange. A grand estate where secrets fester beneath polished smiles. Lawrence Mortimer lies dead in the library. A silver letter opener in his chest, the window open to the night. Was it an outsider who slipped through the shadows, or does the killer sit among the guests, sipping tea and hiding their guilt? Enter Miss Jane Marple, an unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind, unraveling a web of greed, betrayal, and lies. Who forged the codicil that could steal the Grange from its rightful heir? And what deadly truth did Lawrence uncover before his final breath? Chapter 1. The Invitation to Ashwood Grange. The late summer sun cast a golden haze over the village of St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the stone cottages and dappling the hedgerows with light. In her modest sitting-room at Danemead Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. Her eyes, sharp and bright despite her years, flickered occasionally to the garden, where her young maid, Lily, was hanging laundry with a vigour that suggested more enthusiasm than skill. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were not on the laundry, or even the intricate pattern of her knitting. They were occupied by a letter, neatly folded on the table beside her, its crisp envelope bearing the crest of Ashwood Grange. A grand estate some 20 miles distant. The letter was from Mrs. Evelyn Harcourt, an old acquaintance from her school days, though their paths had diverged sharply since. Evelyn, once a spirited girl with a penchant for mischief, had married into wealth and now presided over Ashwood Grange, with her second husband, Colonel Rupert Harcourt. The invitation was for a weekend gathering, a small, intimate affair, Evelyn had written, to celebrate the engagement of her stepdaughter, Cecilia Harcourt, to a young barrister named Lawrence Mortimer. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly as she considered the letter. Evelyn's tone was warm, almost effusive, but there was an undercurrent of unease in her words, a faint tremor in the looping handwriting. "My dear Jane," the letter began, "it has been too long since we reminisced over our youthful follies. I should so value your presence at Ashwood this weekend. There are matters— well, perhaps I am being fanciful, but your good sense would set my mind at ease." The ellipsis had caught Miss Marple's attention. Evelyn was not a woman given to vagueness, and the phrase matters hinted at something more than a mere social call. She set her knitting aside and reached for her spectacles, rereading the letter with the care she might give to a cryptic crossword. "Something is amiss at Ashwood Grange," she murmured to herself. "Evelyn is not the sort to fret without cause." The decision to accept the invitation had been made almost at once. Though not without a certain curiosity tempered by caution, Miss Marple had arranged for Lily to manage the cottage in her absence, and enlisted the help of her nephew, Raymond West, to secure a train ticket to Ashwood Village. Raymond, a writer of some repute, had been mildly amused by the prospect of his aunt venturing into the grandeur of Ashwood Grange. "You'll be solving murders before the weekend's out, Aunt Jane," he teased, to which she replied with a serene smile, "My dear Raymond, I hope it will be nothing so dramatic." Now, as the train rattled through the countryside, Miss Marple sat opposite Mr. Arthur Bantry, a retired solicitor and old friend who had agreed to accompany her. Arthur, a widower with a penchant for local gossip, was not unlike Captain Hastings in his earnestness. though he lacked the captain's military bearing. His round face was flushed with the excitement of the journey, and he adjusted his spectacles as he peered out at the rolling fields. "Splendid place, Ashwood Grange," Arthur said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Old Colonel Harcourt keeps it in fine order, they say, though I hear the family's not without its troubles. That stepdaughter of his, Cecilia, is it, has a bit of a reputation." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "A reputation, Arthur? Do enlighten me." He leaned forward, lowering his voice as though the other passengers might overhear. "Well, nothing scandalous, mind you, but she's a modern sort. Independent, headstrong. They say she jilted a fellow last year, a doctor, I believe, and now she's engaged to this Mortimer chap. Bit quick, if you ask me." "Youth is often impatient," Miss Marple remarked, her tone mild but her mind already cataloguing the information. "And what of the rest of the household?" Arthur rubbed his chin. "Let's see. There's Evelyn, of course. Charming woman, but a touch high-strung, they say. Colonel Harcourt, her husband, is a military man through and through. Bit of a temper, I hear, but devoted to Evelyn. Then there's the Colonel's brother, Gerald Harcourt, who lives at the Grange. A widower, bit of a recluse. Oh, and Mrs. Clara Winthrop, Evelyn's cousin, who's staying there too. She's a widow as well, with a sharp tongue, from what I've heard. And the staff, of course, maids, a butler, the usual lot." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers resting lightly on the handle of her handbag. "A varied party. And this Lawrence Mortimer, the fiancé, what is known of him?" "Not much," Arthur admitted. "He's a barrister. Rising star in London, they say. Handsome, clever, but perhaps a bit too smooth for his own good. You know the type." "Indeed I do," Miss Marple said softly, her thoughts drifting to a certain young man in St. Mary Mead, who had charmed half the village before his true character was revealed. First impressions can be so deceptive. The train slowed as it approached Ashwood Village, and Miss Marple gathered her things with the quiet efficiency of one accustomed to order. Arthur, ever gallant, offered to carry her small suitcase, and together they stepped onto the platform, where a chauffeur in a smart uniform awaited them. The drive to Ashwood Grange was brief but striking, the road winding through dense woods before opening onto a sweeping lawn. The Grange itself was a Georgian masterpiece, its stone facade glowing in the afternoon light, its windows glinting like watchful eyes. They were greeted at the door by Evelyn Harcourt herself, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and an air of nervous energy. Her smile was warm but strained, and her eyes darted briefly to Miss Marple's face, as though seeking reassurance. "Jane, my dear, how good of you to come," Evelyn said, clasping Miss Marple's hands. "And Mr. Bantry, such a pleasure. Do come in. The others are in the drawing-room." The drawing-room was a study in elegance, with high ceilings, polished mahogany, and a grand fireplace. The gathered company rose to greet the newcomers, and Miss Marple's keen eyes took in each face with the precision of a portrait artist. Colonel Rupert Harcourt, a broad-shouldered man with a clipped moustache, exuded authority but seemed distracted, his gaze flickering to the window. Cecilia Harcourt, the bride-to-be, was a striking young woman with auburn hair and a defiant tilt to her chin, her engagement ring catching the light as she moved. Lawrence Mortimer, her fiancé, was indeed handsome, with a polished smile and an easy manner that bordered on arrogance. Gerald Harcourt, the Colonel's brother, was a thin, pale man with a nervous habit of adjusting his cuffs. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, Evelyn's cousin, was a formidable woman in her 50s, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she surveyed the room. The butler, a stoic figure named Parsons, announced tea, and the conversation turned to pleasantries. Weather, the beauty of the Grange, the upcoming wedding. Yet Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of tension, like a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious melody. Cecilia's laughter was a fraction too bright, Lawrence's compliments too practised. Evelyn's hands twisted in her lap, and Colonel Harcourt's responses were curt, almost brusque. As tea was served, Miss Marple observed the interactions with quiet intensity. She noted the way Cecilia avoided her stepmother's gaze, the way Gerald Harcourt's fingers trembled slightly as he lifted his cup, the way Clara Winthrop's smile never reached her eyes. Arthur, blissfully unaware of these subtleties, chatted amiably about the local hunt. But Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of a puzzle she could not yet fully see. Dinner that evening was a formal affair, with candlelight casting shadows on the panelled walls. The conversation turned to Cecilia's engagement, and Lawrence spoke at length about his plans for a chambers in London. Miss Marple listened, her expression one of polite interest, but her thoughts were on Evelyn's earlier words. There are matters. What matters, she wondered, could prompt such unease in a woman as composed as Evelyn Harcourt? As the clock struck 9, a scream shattered the calm. It came from the library, a piercing cry that sent the party scrambling to their feet. Colonel Harcourt was the first to reach the door, with Miss Marple and Arthur close behind. Inside, they found Cecilia, pale and trembling, standing over the body of Lawrence Mortimer. He lay sprawled on the rug, a letter opener protruding from his chest, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. "Good heavens!" Arthur gasped, his hand clutching Miss Marple's arm. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, taking in the overturned chair, the scattered papers, the open window letting in a chill breeze. "Most distressing," she murmured, her voice calm, but her eyes alight with purpose. "It seems, Arthur, that our weekend at Ashwood Grange has taken a most unexpected turn." Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The library at Ashwood Grange was a cavernous room, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and heavy oak shelves that seemed to absorb the flickering light of the chandelier. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and wax polish, now tinged with the metallic tang of blood. Lawrence Mortimer's body lay at the centre of the scene, the letter opener buried in his chest, a stark intrusion against the room's elegance. Cecilia Harcourt stood frozen, her hands clasped over her mouth, her auburn hair dishevelled as though she had run her fingers through it in distress. The scream that had summoned the household still seemed to echo in the silence. Colonel Rupert Harcourt, his face a mask of grim authority, was the first to act. "Parsons!" he barked, turning to the butler, who hovered at the doorway, his usual composure shaken. "Telephone the police at once, and fetch Dr. Langley from the village. He's the nearest." Parsons nodded, his movements mechanical, and disappeared into the hall. Miss Jane Marple, standing just inside the threshold, observed the scene with a quiet intensity. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, moved from the body to the overturned chair, the scattered papers on the desk, and the open window, where a breeze stirred the heavy curtains. Arthur Bantry, at her side, clutched his handkerchief, his face pale. "Good Lord, Jane," he whispered, "what a ghastly thing!" "Ghastly indeed," Miss Marple replied softly, her tone measured. "But we must remain calm, Arthur. There is much to observe before the police arrive." Evelyn Harcourt, her hands trembling, approached Cecilia, who had sunk into a chair, her eyes wide with shock. "My dear, what happened?" Evelyn's voice was strained, her earlier unease now fully exposed. "Did you see anything, anyone?" Cecilia shook her head, her voice barely audible. I came to find Lawrence. We were to discuss the wedding, plans after dinner. I found him like this." Her gaze darted to the letter opener, and she shuddered, turning away. Miss Marple noted the girl's pallor, the way her hands twisted together, and the faint quiver in her voice. Grief, certainly, but was there something else? Guilt, perhaps, or fear? She filed the observation away, her mind already sifting through possibilities like a gardener sorting seeds. Colonel Harcourt, meanwhile, was pacing near the fireplace, his military bearing at odds with the nervous energy in his movements. "This is monstrous," he muttered. "In my own house. Whoever did this will answer for it." Gerald Harcourt, the colonel's brother, stood apart, his thin frame almost lost in the shadows. His eyes, dark and unreadable, flickered toward the body, then away. "A tragedy," he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Poor Lawrence." Mrs. Clara Winthrop, Evelyn's cousin, was less restrained. "Poor Lawrence, indeed," she snapped, her sharp features drawn tight. "The man was a bounder, if you ask me, too charming by half. I wouldn't be surprised if he brought this on himself." "Clara," Evelyn exclaimed, her tone sharp. "How can you say such a thing at a time like this?" Clara sniffed, undeterred. "I speak as I find, Evelyn. He was too smooth, that one. Always smiling, always talking. Men like that have enemies." Miss Marple's lips twitched in the faintest of smiles. Clara's bluntness, she thought, was not unlike that of Mrs. Price in St. Mary Mead, who could be relied upon to voice what others only whispered. But Clara's words were a clue in themselves, a suggestion of hidden animosities, of secrets lurking beneath the polished surface of Ashwood Grange. She stepped forward, her small figure unassuming yet commanding attention. "If I may," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "it would be wise to disturb nothing until the police arrive. The position of every object, every detail, may be significant." Colonel Harcourt turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Miss Marple, surely you don't mean to involve yourself in this horror?" "I merely suggest caution," she replied, her eyes meeting his with serene confidence. "The truth has a way of revealing itself through the smallest particulars." Arthur, recovering his composure, nodded vigorously. "Jane's right, Colonel. Best leave things as they are. The police will want to see everything." The group fell silent, their gazes shifting uneasily between the body and the room's contents. Miss Marple took the opportunity to observe more closely. The letter opener, she noted, was a heavy silver piece, its handle engraved with the Harcourt crest, a family heirloom, perhaps, or a decorative item kept on the desk. The wound suggested a single forceful blow, delivered with precision or rage. Lawrence's body lay at an angle, one arm outstretched, as though he had reached for something, or someone, in his final moments. Her eyes moved to the desk, where a few sheets of paper lay scattered, one bearing a half-written letter in Lawrence's hand. She could not read it from where she stood, but the ink was fresh, the pen still uncapped. Nearby, a glass of brandy sat untouched, its amber contents catching the light. The window, open just a crack, allowed a draught that fluttered the curtains. Outside, the darkness was absolute, the woods surrounding the Grange impenetrable. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Parsons, who announced that the police and Dr. Langley were on their way. "It will be 20 minutes, sir," he said to the Colonel. "The village is not far, but the roads are narrow." "Very well," Colonel Harcourt replied, his tone clipped. "Everyone to the drawing-room. We'll wait there." Miss Marple lingered a moment, her gaze sweeping the room once more. She noted the position of the furniture, the faint scuff on the rug near the window, the way the curtains hung slightly askew. "A most curious scene," she murmured to Arthur as they followed the others out. "The library tells a story, but we must listen carefully to hear it." In the drawing-room, the atmosphere was heavy with shock and suspicion. Cecilia sat by the fire, her hands clasped tightly, while Evelyn hovered nearby, offering a glass of water that went untouched. Colonel Harcourt resumed his pacing, his boots thudding softly on the carpet. Gerald sat in a corner, his eyes fixed on a book he did not read, while Clara Winthrop perched on a sofa, her expression one of barely concealed disdain. Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her knitting bag at her side, though she made no move to open it. Instead, she observed the room's occupants, her mind cataloguing their behaviours. Cecilia's grief seemed genuine, yet there was a stiffness in her posture, as though she were holding something back. Evelyn's nervous glances suggested fear, not of the crime itself, perhaps, but of its consequences. The Colonel's agitation hinted at a man accustomed to control, now confronted with chaos. Gerald's silence was a puzzle, his detachment almost unnatural. And Clara, her sharp words and sharper eyes, suggested a woman who saw more than she said. Arthur, attempting to lighten the mood, ventured a comment about the weather, but it fell flat. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, marking the passage of time until the distant sound of a car engine announced the arrival of the police. Inspector Grayson, a sturdy man with a no-nonsense demeanour, entered with Dr. Langley, a grey-haired physician who carried himself with the quiet authority of long experience. Dr. Langley knelt beside Lawrence's body, his examination brief but thorough. "Dead for no more than an hour," he announced. "Single stab wound to the chest, likely fatal within moments." The letter opener pierced the heart. Inspector Grayson surveyed the room, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Right," he said briskly. "I'll need statements from everyone. Who found the body?" "I did," Cecilia said, her voice trembling. "At 9 o'clock, just after dinner. I came to speak with Lawrence and found him like this." Grayson nodded, scribbling in his notebook. "And the rest of you, where were you at 9? The alibis came quickly, each delivered with varying degrees of conviction. Colonel Harcourt had been in the billiard room, alone, reviewing estate accounts. Evelyn had been in her sitting room, writing letters. Gerald claimed to have been in the conservatory, tending to his orchids. Clara had been in the morning room, reading. The servants, questioned separately, reported routine tasks, Parsons in the pantry, the maids in the kitchen. Miss Marple listened, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind was racing. The alibis were too neat, too perfectly timed. 9 o'clock, she thought, was a precise moment. And yet no one had heard anything until Cecilia's scream. The open window, the scuff on the rug, the untouched brandy, all were pieces of a puzzle that did not yet fit. As Grayson continued his questions, Miss Marple leaned toward Arthur. "There is something here that does not align," she whispered. "The library is a stage, and we have yet to understand the play." Arthur frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean, Jane?" She smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving the group. "In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a young man who claimed to be elsewhere when a theft occurred. His alibi was perfect, until I noticed his shoes were muddy, though he swore he had not left the house. The truth, Arthur, is in the details." Chapter 3. The arrival of Miss Marple's insight. The drawing-room at Ashwood Grange was oppressively silent, save for the faint crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the old house settling. The police, under Inspector Grayson's brisk direction, had cordoned off the library, and Dr. Langley had departed after confirming Lawrence Mortimer's death. The household, now gathered in the drawing-room, sat in a state of uneasy anticipation, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of the fire. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her armchair, appeared as unassuming as ever, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes moving from one face to another with the quiet precision of a clockmaker inspecting gears. Arthur Bantry, at her side, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier shock giving way to a restless curiosity. "Jane," he whispered, leaning closer, "what do you make of it all?" Poor Mortimer, stabbed in his own library. Well, the Colonel's library, but you know what I mean. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile, but her eyes remained fixed on Cecilia Harcourt, who sat clutching a handkerchief, her face pale but composed. "It is a puzzle, Arthur," she replied softly. "But puzzles, you know, are solved not by rushing, but by observing. The library holds many secrets, and I suspect the people in this room hold more." Inspector Grayson, a man of methodical habits but limited imagination, was taking statements with the diligence of a clerk. He stood by the mantel, his notebook open, his pencil moving steadily as he questioned the household. "Miss Harcourt," he said, addressing Cecilia, "you say you entered the library at 9 o'clock precisely. Can anyone confirm your movements before that?" Cecilia's eyes flickered, and she hesitated before answering. "I was in the drawing-room with the others until about 10 minutes to 9. Then I went upstairs to fetch my shawl. I came down and went straight to the library." "And you saw no one else?" Grayson pressed. "No one," she said, her voice firm, but her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. "The corridor was empty." Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in Cecilia's hands, the way her gaze darted toward her stepmother, Evelyn, before returning to the inspector. A small detail, but significant, she thought. In St. Mary Mead, she had once observed a young woman whose nervous glances betrayed a secret affair. Cecilia's behavior was not dissimilar. Grayson turned to Evelyn next. "Mrs. Harcourt, you were in your sitting room at 9, correct?" Evelyn nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Yes, Inspector. I was writing letters. I heard nothing until Cecilia's scream." "And you, Colonel Harcourt?" Grayson asked, his tone respectful but probing. The Colonel, who had ceased his pacing and now stood by the window, turned sharply. "I was in the billiard room, as I said, going over accounts. I heard the scream and came at once." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The billiard room, she recalled, was at the far end of the house, yet the Colonel had been among the first to reach the library. A man of his age and build could move quickly, of course, but the timing intrigued her. She made a mental note to examine the layout of the Grange more closely. Gerald Harcourt, when questioned, repeated his claim of tending orchids in the conservatory. His voice was low, almost monotone, and he avoided meeting the inspector's gaze. Clara Winthrop, with characteristic bluntness, declared she had been reading in the morning room and had no earthly reason to be skulking about the library. The servants' alibis, Parsons in the pantry, the maids in the kitchen, were equally straightforward, though Miss Marple noted that the young housemaid, Ellen, seemed unusually nervous, her eyes darting toward Parsons as she spoke. As Grayson continued his inquiries, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the library itself. She had not been permitted to re-enter, but her memory of the scene was vivid. The overturned chair, the scattered papers, the open window, the untouched brandy. The letter opener, with its Harcourt crest, was particularly intriguing. It suggested an impulsive act. Why choose a weapon so closely tied to the family unless it was a moment of passion or desperation? Yet the precision of the wound hinted at calculation. A contradiction, she thought, and contradictions were the threads that unravelled mysteries. "Jane," Arthur whispered, interrupting her reverie, "you're awfully quiet. Have you spotted something the inspector's missed?" "Not missed, perhaps," she replied, her voice barely audible. "But there are details he has not yet considered. The window, for instance. It was open, yet the night was cool. Why would Lawrence open it?" Arthur frowned. "To let in some air, I suppose. It was stuffy in there." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. "But in St. Mary Mead, I once knew a man who left a window open not for air, but to create the appearance of an intruder. The truth, you see, is often in what is not said." Before Arthur could respond, the door opened, and Parsons announced the arrival of a new figure. A tall, wiry man in his 60s, with a neatly trimmed moustache and an air of quiet authority. Miss Marple recognized him at once. Sir Henry Clithering, former Commissioner of Scotland Yard and an old friend. His presence was unexpected but not unwelcome, and she felt a flicker of satisfaction at the prospect of his involvement. "Sir Henry!" Evelyn exclaimed, rising to greet him. "What brings you here?" "I was dining with friends in the village," Sir Henry said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of experience. "I heard of the trouble and thought I might be of assistance. Inspector Grayson, I presume?" Grayson, clearly aware of Sir Henry's reputation, straightened. "Yes, sir. A murder, I'm afraid. Lawrence Mortimer, stabbed in the library. We're just taking statements." Sir Henry's eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on Miss Marple. A faint smile touched his lips, and she returned it with a slight nod. They had crossed paths before, in St. Mary Mead and elsewhere, and she knew him to be a man of keen perception, though perhaps too inclined to trust official methods. "I see you're in good company," Sir Henry said, addressing Miss Marple directly. "I trust you've been observing, Miss Marple." "Oh, I am merely a guest," she replied, her tone demure. "But one cannot help noticing certain things." "Indeed," Sir Henry said, his eyes twinkling. "And what have you noticed?" Miss Marple hesitated, aware of the eyes upon her. "Only that the library is a most interesting room," she said carefully. "The objects within it, the papers, the brandy, the window, tell a story, if one listens." Grayson, who had been listening with a touch of impatience, cleared his throat. "With respect, Miss Marple, we'll stick to the facts for now. I'd like to examine the library again. Sir Henry, if you'd care to join me." Sir Henry nodded, but not before exchanging another glance with Miss Marple. As the men left, she turned her attention back to the household. Cecilia had risen and was speaking quietly with Evelyn, their heads bent together. Colonel Harcourt had resumed his pacing, his boots thudding softly. Gerald remained in his corner, his expression unreadable, while Clara Winthrop watched the room with the intensity of a hawk. Miss Marple leaned toward Arthur. "I should like to speak with Cecilia," she said quietly. "There is something in her manner that puzzles me." Arthur, ever eager to assist, nodded. "Shall I fetch her?" "No need," Miss Marple said, rising with a grace that belied her years. "I shall join her by the fire." Approaching Cecilia, Miss Marple adopted her most sympathetic tone. "My dear, what a dreadful shock this must be. Would you care to tell me about Lawrence? It may help to speak of him." Cecilia's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "He was wonderful," she said, her voice breaking. "So clever, so ambitious. We were to be married in the spring. I can't believe he's gone." Miss Marple listened, her expression one of gentle concern, but her mind was alert. Cecilia's words were heartfelt, yet there was a rehearsed quality to them, as though she had prepared her grief. "And you went to the library to discuss the wedding?" she prompted. "Yes," Cecilia said quickly. "Just a few details, nothing important." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes noting the way Cecilia's fingers twisted the handkerchief. "And the library door? Was it open when you arrived?" Cecilia hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. I think so. Yes, it was open." "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said, patting her hand. "You've been most helpful." As she returned to her seat, Miss Marple's thoughts were racing. Cecilia's hesitation, the open door, the untouched brandy, all were pieces of a puzzle that did not yet fit. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young woman's hesitation had revealed a lie about a stolen brooch. The truth, she knew, lay in the gaps between words, the pauses that betrayed what was unsaid. "Jane," Arthur whispered, "you've got that look again. What's on your mind?" "Only that this house is full of secrets," she replied softly, "and I intend to find them out." Chapter 4. The Questions Begin. The drawing-room at Ashwood Grange seemed to grow smaller as the night wore on, the heavy drapes and flickering firelight casting shadows that danced across the faces of the assembled company. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her armchair, her hands folded over her knitting bag, her eyes moving from one person to another with the calm precision of a chess player studying the board. The arrival of Sir Henry Clithering had shifted the dynamics of the room, his authoritative presence lending a sense of order to the chaos that Lawrence Mortimer's murder had unleashed. Yet Miss Marple knew that order was an illusion. Beneath the polite facades of the household, currents of fear, guilt, and suspicion swirled like leaves in a storm. Inspector Grayson returned from the library with Sir Henry, his notebook now filled with scribbled observations. "Right," he said, addressing the group with a briskness that bordered on impatience. "I've examined the scene, and will need to speak with each of you individually. No one is to leave the Grange until we've got to the bottom of this." Colonel Harcourt bristled, his moustache twitching. "See here, Inspector, this is my home. I'll not have my guests treated like criminals." "With respect, sir," Grayson replied, his tone firm but deferential. "A man's been murdered under your roof. Everyone's a suspect until we prove otherwise." Evelyn Harcourt, seated beside Cecilia, gave a small gasp, her hand flying to her throat. "Surely you don't think one of us—" Her voice trailed off, her eyes darting nervously to Miss Marple, as though seeking reassurance. Miss Marple met her gaze with a serene smile. "The inspector is only doing his duty, Evelyn," she said gently. "The truth will emerge, as it always does, given time and observation." Sir Henry, who had been watching the exchange with interest, cleared his throat. "Miss Marple is quite right," he said. "And if I may, Inspector, I'd suggest you start with the timeline. Establishing where everyone was at 9 o'clock is critical." Grayson nodded, flipping open his notebook. "Very well. Miss Harcourt, let's go over your statement again. You entered the library at 9 and found Mr. Mortimer dead. Did you touch anything?" Cecilia's face paled, but she shook her head. "No, I was too shocked. I saw the letter opener and screamed. I didn't touch anything." Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation in Cecilia's voice, the way her eyes flickered toward the floor. It was a small thing, but in St. Mary Mead she had once known a girl whose hesitation over a missing necklace had revealed a theft. She made a mental note to revisit Cecilia's account later. Grayson moved on to Evelyn. "Mrs. Harcourt, you were in your sitting room. Can anyone confirm that?" Evelyn's hands twisted in her lap. "No, I was alone, but I assure you, I was there until I heard Cecilia scream." The inspector's pencil scratched across the page. "And you, Colonel Harcourt?" "As I said, I was in the billiard room," the colonel replied, his voice gruff. "No one was with me. I was checking the estate accounts, tedious work, but necessary." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The billiard room, she recalled, was at the opposite end of the house from the library. Yet the colonel had reached the scene almost as quickly as Cecilia. A fit man could cover the distance swiftly, but the timing was tight. She filed the observation away, her mind already turning to the layout of the Grange. Gerald Harcourt, when questioned, repeated his claim of being in the conservatory. "I was tending my orchids," he said, his voice soft but steady. "They require careful attention, especially at night." Clara Winthrop, with her characteristic bluntness, scoffed. "Orchids at 9 o'clock? Really, Gerald, that's the best you can do." Gerald's eyes flashed, but he said nothing, his fingers adjusting his cuffs in a nervous tic Miss Marple had noted earlier. Clara, undeterred, confirmed her own alibi, reading in the morning room, and added, "I heard nothing until Cecilia's caterwauling. If you ask me, the girl's hiding something." "Clara, please," Evelyn exclaimed, her voice sharp with reproach. Miss Marple watched the exchange closely, noting Clara's relish in stirring tension. There was a spitefulness there, she thought, not unlike Mrs. Elspeth in St. Mary Mead, who delighted in exposing her neighbour's flaws. Clara's words, however, were a clue in themselves, a suggestion that Cecilia's grief might mask a deeper truth. As Grayson continued his interviews, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the library. She had not been permitted to re-enter, but her memory was sharp. The overturned chair, the scattered papers, the open window, the untouched brandy. The letter opener, with its Harcourt crest, was particularly significant. It was a family heirloom, kept on the desk, yet someone had used it as a weapon. Was it a spontaneous act, or had it been chosen deliberately to cast suspicion on the Harcourts? She leaned toward Arthur Bantry, who was fidgeting in his seat. "Arthur," she whispered, "do you recall the position of the papers on the desk? Were they scattered randomly, or did they seem arranged?" Arthur frowned, his brow furrowing. "I'm not sure, Jane. It all happened so fast. But I think, yes, there was a letter, half written, in Lawrence's hand. The rest looked like they'd been knocked about." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the detail. A half-written letter suggested Lawrence had been interrupted, perhaps by his killer. The contents of the letter could be critical. She resolved to ask Sir Henry if she might examine it later. The interviews continued, with the servants providing their alibis. Parsons, the butler, reiterated that he had been in the pantry, polishing silver. The housemaid, Ellen, confirmed she was in the kitchen with the cook, though her voice trembled, and her eyes darted toward Parsons. Miss Marple noted the girl's nervousness, recalling a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where a maid's anxiety had revealed her knowledge of a theft. Was Ellen hiding something, or was she simply overwhelmed by the tragedy? When Grayson finished, he closed his notebook with a snap. "That's all for now," he said. "I'll need to speak with each of you again tomorrow. No one leaves the Grange without my permission." Colonel Harcourt's face reddened, but before he could protest, Sir Henry intervened. "A sensible precaution, Inspector, and perhaps Miss Marple might offer her insights. She has a remarkable knack for seeing what others miss." Grayson's expression was sceptical, but he nodded. "If Miss Marple has anything to add, I'm all ears." Miss Marple smiled demurely, her hands smoothing her skirt. "I am merely an observer, Inspector," she said, "but I would suggest paying close attention to the library. The window, for instance. Why was it open on such a cool night? And the brandy, untouched, yet poured. These are small things, but they may tell us much." Grayson's eyes narrowed, but he made a note. "I'll look into it. For now, everyone should get some rest. We'll resume in the morning." As the household dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on Cecilia, who was whispering urgently to Evelyn. The girl's grief seemed genuine, yet there was a guardedness in her posture, a tension that suggested more than mourning. Miss Marple approached, her manner gentle but purposeful. "Cecilia, my dear," she said, "I wonder if you might tell me more about Lawrence's plans. He was writing a letter, I understand, when he was interrupted." Cecilia's eyes widened, and she hesitated. "A letter? I don't know. He often wrote to his colleagues in London. It was probably nothing important." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but her mind alert. Cecilia's hesitation was telling, and the mention of colleagues suggested a line of inquiry. Had Lawrence been involved in something beyond his engagement to Cecilia? A professional rivalry, perhaps, or a financial dispute? As Cecilia excused herself, Miss Marple turned to Sir Henry, who had been watching from across the room. "Sir Henry," she said quietly, "might I have a word?" "Of course," he replied, gesturing to a corner of the room. "What's on your mind, Miss Marple?" She lowered her voice, her eyes bright with purpose. "The library, Sir Henry. I should like to see it again with your permission. There are details, the papers, the window, that may hold the key to this puzzle." Sir Henry's smile was one of respect. "I thought you might say that. I'll arrange it with Grayson. But tell me, what do you suspect?" Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Suspect is too strong a word, Sir Henry. Let us say I am curious. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a man who left a glass of wine untouched, claiming he had poured it by mistake. Later, we learned it was poisoned. The truth, you see, is in the things left undone." Sir Henry chuckled softly. "You're a marvel, Miss Marple. I'll see to it you get your look at the library." As the household retired for the night, Miss Marple remained in the drawing-room, her thoughts racing. The library was a stage, and Lawrence's death was the climax of a drama she had yet to understand. But the clues were there, waiting to be pieced together, and she was determined to find them. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Ashwood Grange, casting a pale light over the drawing-room where the household gathered for breakfast. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the clink of china and the murmur of polite conversation doing little to mask the unease that had settled over the group. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the far end of the table, sipped her tea with an air of serene detachment, her eyes moving from one face to another, cataloguing every glance, every gesture. The murder of Lawrence Mortimer had cast a shadow over the Grange, and the arrival of Inspector Grayson and Sir Henry Clithering only deepened the sense of scrutiny. Arthur Bantry, ever the optimist, attempted to lighten the mood. "Fine spread, this," he said, gesturing to the array of scones, jam, and kedgeree. "Mrs. Harcourt, you've outdone yourself." Evelyn managed a wan smile. "Thank Parsons and the cook, Mr. Bantry. I fear I've had little to do with it this morning." Her words were polite, but Miss Marple noted the strain in her voice, and the way her hands fluttered nervously over her napkin. Evelyn's unease, she thought, was not merely the shock of murder, but something deeper, perhaps a fear of what the investigation might uncover. Inspector Grayson, who had arrived early to continue his inquiries, stood by the window, his notebook in hand. "I've had a preliminary report from the coroner," he announced, his voice cutting through the room's fragile calm. "Mr. Mortimer died between 8:45 and 9 p.m. The letter opener was the murder weapon, and there are no fingerprints other than his own, likely wiped clean. We're dealing with a careful killer." A murmur rippled through the room. Cecilia Harcourt, seated beside her stepmother, gripped her teacup tightly, her knuckles white. "No fingerprints," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then it could have been anyone." "Indeed," Grayson replied, his eyes narrowing. "Which brings me to a discovery made this morning. Parsons, the butler, found this in the shrubbery outside the library window." He held up a small object, wrapped in a handkerchief. A man's pocket watch, its silver case glinting in the light. Colonel Harcourt's face darkened. "That's mine," he said, rising abruptly. "It's been missing for days. How the devil did it end up outside?" Grayson's expression was unreadable. "Can you account for its whereabouts, Colonel?" "Of course not," the Colonel snapped. "I told you it was lost. I assumed it was misplaced in the house." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened behind her spectacles. The watch was a significant find, and its placement outside the library suggested an attempt to incriminate the Colonel. In St. Mary Mead, She had once known a gardener who lost a tool near a scene of vandalism, only to be revealed as the culprit. Was the Colonel being framed, or had he been careless in his own guilt? Sir Henry Clithering, who had been observing quietly, spoke up. "A curious detail, Inspector. The watch suggests someone left the library through the window, perhaps to create the impression of an outsider. Have you searched the grounds?" "We're doing so now," Grayson said, "but the ground is dry, no clear footprints. The watch is our best lead so far, and it points to someone in this house." The accusation hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted the reactions of the group. Cecilia's eyes darted to her stepfather, a flicker of fear crossing her face. Evelyn's hands trembled, and she quickly set down her cup. Gerald Harcourt, silent as ever, adjusted his cuffs, his face impassive. Clara Winthrop, however, leaned forward, her sharp eyes gleaming with interest. "If you ask me," Clara said, her voice cutting through the silence, "the Colonel's watch is a bit too convenient. Whoever did this wanted us to think it was Rupert. I'd look closer at the servants, Parsons for instance. He's been with the family for years, knows all our habits." Parsons, who had just entered with a fresh pot of tea, stiffened but said nothing. Miss Marple observed his reaction, noting the slight tightening of his jaw. Clara's accusation was bold, perhaps deliberately provocative, but it served to shift suspicion from the family to the staff. A classic diversion, she thought. Grayson turned to Parsons. "You found the watch, you say? When exactly?" "This morning, sir," Parsons replied, his voice steady. "At 7:30, while checking the grounds as part of my duties. It was caught in the laurel bushes, just below the library window." "And you didn't see it last night?" Grayson pressed. "No, sir. It was dark, and I had no reason to inspect the shrubbery then." Miss Marple's mind was racing. The watch was a red herring, she was certain. A planted clue meant to mislead. But by whom? The Colonel's temper and military precision made him an obvious suspect, yet his reaction to the watch seemed genuine. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a stolen ring had been found in a servant's room, only to be revealed as a ploy by the true thief. The watch, she thought, was part of a larger performance. As breakfast concluded, Sir Henry approached Miss Marple, his expression one of quiet amusement. "You've been very quiet, Miss Marple. What do you make of this watch business?" She smiled faintly, her hands smoothing her skirt. "It is a distraction, Sir Henry. The watch is meant to draw our attention, much like a conjurer's trick. But the real truth lies elsewhere, in the library, I believe, and in the people who were there." Sir Henry nodded, his eyes twinkling. "I thought you'd say that. Grayson's agreed to let you examine the library this morning, under my supervision. Shall we?" Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate. "I should be most grateful, Sir Henry." Jatash's library, when they entered, was much as it had been the previous night, though the body had been removed. The overturned chair remained, as did the scattered papers and the untouched brandy. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes taking in every detail. She paused by the desk, noting the half-written letter in Lawrence's hand. With Sir Henry's permission, she lifted it carefully, her spectacles perched on her nose. The letter was addressed to a Mr. Charles Vernon, a name unfamiliar to her. It read, "Dear Charles, I must speak with you urgently regarding the matter we discussed. The situation has become untenable, and I fear—" The sentence broke off. The ink smudged as though the pen had been dropped. "A most intriguing interruption," Miss Marple murmured. "Lawrence was writing something of importance, and someone ensured he did not finish." Sir Henry peered over her shoulder. Charles Vernon. Could be a colleague, perhaps. Mortimer was a barrister, after all. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. "But the urgency suggests more than professional matters. I should like to know more about this Mr. Vernon." She moved to the window, examining the sill. The scuff mark on the rug was still visible, and she noted a faint smudge of dirt on the frame, barely noticeable but significant. "Someone climbed through here," she said, almost to herself, "but whether to enter or escape, I cannot yet say." Sir Henry raised an eyebrow. "You think the watch was planted to suggest an outsider?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that someone wishes us to believe many things. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a woman who left a glove in a neighbour's garden to suggest a burglary. The truth was far simpler. She had stolen her own jewels for the insurance." Sir Henry chuckled. "You're a marvel, Miss Marple. Grayson will have his work cut out for him with you around." As they left the library, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the household. The watch pointed to Colonel Harcourt, but its discovery was too convenient, too theatrical. Clara's accusation against Parsons was another distraction, designed to shift focus from the family. And Cecilia's hesitation, her guarded responses, suggested she knew more than she admitted. The letter to Charles Vernon was a new thread, one that might lead to the heart of the mystery. Back in the drawing room, Miss Marple observed the group with renewed focus. Cecilia was speaking quietly with Evelyn, her expression strained. The Colonel was conferring with Grayson, his voice low but heated. Gerald sat alone, his eyes fixed on his hands, while Clara watched the room with her usual sharpness. "Arthur," Miss Marple whispered, "I should like to speak with Parsons. There is something in his manner that interests me." Arthur nodded, eager to assist. "I'll fetch him, but Jane, what are you thinking?" "Only that the truth is like a tapestry," she replied, softly. "Each thread seems separate, but together they form a picture. And I believe we are beginning to see its outline." Chapter 6. A clue in detail. The morning at Ashwood Grange was heavy with the weight of suspicion, the grandeur of the estate overshadowed by the grim reality of Lawrence Mortimer's murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a quiet corner of the drawing-room, observed the household with her usual calm detachment, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The act of knitting was, for her, a way to steady her hands while her mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle that was the murder in the library. The Colonel's pocket watch, found so conveniently outside the window, had stirred the pot of suspicion. But Miss Marple was certain it was a distraction. A red herring meant to obscure the truth. Arthur Bantry, ever her loyal companion, leaned closer, his voice low. "Jane, you've got that look again. What's caught your eye now?" Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "A small thing, Arthur," she replied softly. "But in my experience, it is the small things that matter most. In St. Mary Mead, I once solved a theft because of a misplaced button. Here, I believe it is a matter of timing and placement." Before Arthur could press her further, Parsons, the butler, entered the room to clear the breakfast trays. Miss Marple had requested a private word with him, and Arthur, ever obliging, had arranged for them to speak in the small morning room adjacent to the drawing room. As Parsons approached, Miss Marple noted his impeccable posture, the way his hands moved with practiced precision, and the faint shadow of unease in his eyes. "Parsons," she said, her tone gentle but direct, "I understand you found Colonel Harcourt's watch this morning. A most curious discovery. Could you tell me exactly how you came upon it?" Parsons hesitated, his fingers tightening briefly on the tray he held. "As I told the inspector, madam, I was inspecting the grounds at 7:30. It's my habit to check the exterior of the house each morning. I noticed something glinting in the laurel bushes beneath the library window. It was the Colonel's watch, caught on a branch." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes fixed on his face. "And you are certain it was not there last night?" "I cannot say, madam," Parsons replied, his voice steady but cautious. "It was dark, and I had no reason to look closely at the shrubbery then." "And yet," Miss Marple said, her tone almost conversational, "the watch was found in a place where one might expect to look, was it not?" "Just below the window, where anyone might notice it in the daylight." Parsons's expression remained impassive, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw, a gesture she had seen in St. Mary Mead, when a shopkeeper was questioned about a missing ledger. "I suppose so, madam," he said. "Reported it to the inspector at once." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "You are most diligent, Parsons. One last thing. Did you happen to notice anything unusual in the library last night, before Miss Cecilia's scream?" Parsons hesitated again, and Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the flicker of unease. "Nothing specific, madam," he said. "I was in the pantry, as I told the inspector. But, well, I did hear a door close earlier, perhaps around 8:30. I thought nothing of it at the time." "A door," Miss Marple repeated, her voice soft. "Most interesting. Thank you, Parsons." As the butler withdrew, Miss Marple turned to Arthur, her expression thoughtful. "A door closing at 8:30, she murmured. "That is a detail worth noting, Arthur. The library door, perhaps, or another nearby. It suggests movement before the murder." Arthur frowned, puzzled. "But everyone claims they were elsewhere at that time. Could it have been Lawrence himself?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said, "but I think not. Lawrence was writing a letter, and the ink was fresh when he was killed. He was at the desk, not moving about. No, someone else was in or near the library, and that someone may hold the key to this mystery." Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Sir Henry Clithering, who had just returned from a second examination of the library with Inspector Grayson. "Miss Marple," he said, his eyes twinkling with respect, "I've persuaded Grayson to let you take another look at the library. He's a bit sceptical, but I assured him your eye for detail is unmatched." Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate. "You're too kind, Sir Henry. I shall be glad to assist, in my small way." The library, when they entered, was a study in contrasts, its elegant furnishings marred by the lingering presence of violence. The overturned chair had been righted, but the scattered papers remained, and the brandy glass stood untouched on the desk. Miss Marple moved to the desk first, her eyes drawn to the half-written letter she had noted earlier. With Sir Henry's permission, she examined it closely, her spectacles perched on her nose. The letter, addressed to Charles Vernon, was brief but telling. "Dear Charles, I must speak with you urgently regarding the matter we discussed. The situation has become untenable, and I fear the smudged ink and abrupt end suggested a sudden interruption, likely the arrival of the killer." "This Charles Vernon," Miss Marple said, turning to Sir Henry. "Do we know anything of him?" "Not yet," Sir Henry replied. "Grayson's sending a telegram to London to inquire. Mortimer was a barrister, so Vernon could be a colleague, a client, or even a rival." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The letter's urgency suggested a matter of great importance. Perhaps a legal dispute, a financial secret, or something more personal. She moved to the window, where the faint smudge of dirt on the sill caught her eye again. Bending closer, she noticed something new. A single delicate thread of blue fabric, barely visible, caught on a splinter of the window frame. "Sir Henry," she said, pointing to the thread, "this is most curious. A thread blue in colour caught here. It suggests someone passed through this window, either entering or leaving." Sir Henry examined the thread, his expression thoughtful. "Could be from a coat or dress, but whose?" "That," Miss Marple said, "is what we must discover. In St. Mary Mead, I once found a thread of red wool that led to a thief. This blue thread may lead us to a murderer." They continued their inspection, Miss Marple noting the position of the brandy glass. It was full, untouched, yet the decanter nearby was slightly askew, as though it had been moved hastily. "Lawrence poured this," she said almost to herself, "but did not drink. Why pour a glass only to leave it?" "Perhaps he was interrupted," Sir Henry suggested. "Or," Miss Marple said, her eyes bright, "he poured it for someone else. Someone who was with him before the murder." The idea hung in the air, a new thread in the tapestry of clues. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the rug where the scuff mark remained. It was faint, but it suggested a struggle, or perhaps someone moving quickly. The overturned chair, the scattered papers, the open window, all pointed to a scene carefully staged, yet imperfectly so. As they left the library, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the household. The blue thread was a tangible clue, one that could be traced to a garment. Cecilia's shawl, she recalled, was blue, but so too was Evelyn's dress from the previous evening. And Parsons, she thought, had been wearing a dark suit with a blue tie. The thread was a small detail, but it was the kind of detail that could unravel a lie. Back in the drawing room, Miss Marple observed the group with renewed focus. Cecilia was speaking quietly with Evelyn, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders. Evelyn's dress, though changed this morning, had been blue last night. Parsons moved silently, clearing the last of the breakfast things, his tie a muted shade of blue. Any of them could be connected to the thread, but Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. "Arthur," she whispered, "I should like to know more about this Charles Vernon, and I think a closer look at Cecilia's shawl and Evelyn's wardrobe might be illuminating." Arthur nodded, his eyes wide. "You think the thread's the key, Jane?" "Not the key," she replied softly, "but a signpost. The truth, Arthur, is in the details, and we are beginning to see their pattern." As the household dispersed, Miss Marple's mind was alive with possibilities. The blue thread, the untouched brandy, the half-written letter, all were pieces of a puzzle that was slowly taking shape. She knew the truth was close, but it would require patience and precision to uncover it. Chapter 7. More lies surface. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Ashwood Grange, casting long shadows across the polished floors. The atmosphere in the drawing-room was one of strained civility, the household's attempts at normalcy undermined by the ever-present spectre of Lawrence Mortimer's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual armchair, her knitting needles moving with a quiet rhythm, though her eyes were far from idle. They darted from face to face, noting the subtle signs of tension, Cecilia's tightly clasped hands, Evelyn's nervous glances, Colonel Harcourt's rigid posture. The discovery of the Colonel's watch and the blue thread in the library had deepened the mystery, and Miss Marple sensed that the truth was beginning to stir beneath the surface, like a fish rising in a still pond. Arthur Bantry, seated beside her, was growing increasingly restless. "Jane," he whispered, leaning closer, "this business with the watch and the thread, it's all so confusing. Do you think the Colonel's involved?" Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "The Colonel is certainly a figure of interest, Arthur," she replied softly, "but I am not convinced he is our culprit. The watch is too obvious, too neatly placed. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a young man who left a monogrammed handkerchief at a scene of mischief to implicate another. The truth, you see, is often obscured by such theatrics." Before Arthur could respond, Inspector Grayson entered, his expression grim. Sir Henry Clithering followed, his demeanour calm but alert. The inspector held a small envelope, which he placed on the table with deliberate care. "We've had a development," Grayson announced, his voice cutting through the room's uneasy murmur. "A telegram from London regarding Charles Vernon, the man to whom Mr. Mortimer was writing his letter." The room fell silent, all eyes on the inspector. Cecilia's face paled, and she leaned forward slightly, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. Evelyn's hand tightened on her armrest, while Colonel Harcourt's moustache twitched with impatience. Gerald Harcourt, as usual, remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. Clara Winthrop, however, leaned forward, her sharp features alight with curiosity. "Well, out with it, man," Clara said brusquely. "Who is this Vernon fellow?" Grayson opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the contents. "Charles Vernon is a solicitor in London specializing in estate law. He and Mortimer were colleagues, often working on the same cases. According to Vernon's office, Mortimer had consulted him recently about a sensitive matter involving a will. They were due to meet next week." "A will?" Colonel Harcourt said, his voice sharp. "Whose will?" "That's unclear," Grayson admitted. Vernon's clerk wasn't privy to the details, but he said Mortimer seemed agitated during their last correspondence. The letter we found in the library suggests it was urgent. Miss Marple's mind raced. A will was a powerful motive. Money, inheritance, betrayal. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a disputed will had led to a bitter feud, though not to murder. Here the stakes seemed higher. Was Lawrence involved in altering a will or contesting one? And whose? She glanced at Cecilia, noting the girl's sudden stillness. "Miss Harcourt," she said gently, "did Lawrence ever mention anything about a will? Perhaps in connection with your family?" Cecilia's eyes widened, and she hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. "No," she said quickly. "He never spoke of such things. We talked mostly of our future, the wedding." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but her mind alert. Cecilia's hesitation was telling, and the shawl, blue like the thread found in the library, drew her attention. She made a mental note to examine it more closely. Grayson, meanwhile, turned to the Colonel. "Colonel Harcourt, you mentioned the watch was lost days ago. Can you be more specific?" The Colonel's face reddened. "I noticed it missing on Tuesday, I believe. I thought it might have fallen behind a dresser, or been misplaced in the billiard room." I certainly didn't drop it outside the library. And yet, Clara interjected, her voice dripping with skepticism, there it was, conveniently placed to make you look guilty. If you ask me, someone's trying to pin this on you, Rupert. Enough, Clara, Evelyn snapped, her composure fraying. This is no time for your accusations. Miss Marple observed the exchange, noting Clara's relish in stirring discord. It was a tactic, she thought, not unlike that of Mrs. Price in St. Mary Mead, who used sharp words to deflect attention from her own secrets. Was Clara merely provocative, or was she hiding something herself? Sir Henry, sensing the rising tension, stepped in. Inspector, perhaps we should focus on the library itself. Miss Marple, you mentioned the thread and the brandy glass. Have you any further thoughts? Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. Only that the library is a stage, Sir Henry, and every prop has a purpose. The brandy, poured but untouched, suggests Lawrence was not alone. The thread, blue and delicate, points to someone who passed through the window, perhaps to create the illusion of an outsider. And the letter to Mr. Vernon hints at a motive tied to money or inheritance. These are threads in a tapestry, and we must weave them carefully. Grayson's expression was skeptical, but he nodded. I'll have the thread analyzed. As for the letter, we'll follow up with Vernon. But I must warn you all, someone in this house knows more than they're saying. As Grayson continued his inquiries, Miss Marple requested a private moment with Evelyn. They withdrew to the morning room, where the light was softer, the air less charged with suspicion. Evelyn's hands trembled as she sat, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face. Jane, she said, her voice low, I'm so afraid. This murder, it's tearing us apart. And Cecilia, she's not herself. I think she's hiding something. Miss Marple's tone was gentle but probing. What makes you say that, Evelyn? Evelyn hesitated, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief. Before dinner last night, I overheard her arguing with Lawrence in the hall. It was brief, but heated. She said something about not going through with it. I didn't think much of it at the time. Lovers' quarrels, you know. But now, Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the revelation. A quarrel, so close to the murder, was significant. In St. Mary Mead, she had once known a couple whose argument over a debt had led to a betrayal. Was Cecilia's disagreement with Lawrence the spark that led to his death? Thank you, Evelyn, she said. You've been most helpful. And your dress last night, the blue one, might I see it? I'm rather fond of fine fabrics. Evelyn blinked, surprised by the request, but nodded. Of course, Jane. It's in my wardrobe. I'll have Ellen fetch it. As Evelyn left to summon the maid, Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, where Arthur was waiting. Jane, he whispered, what's this about Evelyn's dress? The thread, Arthur, she replied softly. It may belong to Cecilia's shawl, Evelyn's dress, or even Parsons's tie. We must know which. When Ellen arrived with the dress, Miss Marple examined it closely, noting its rich blue silk. The fabric was smooth, with no obvious tears or frayed edges. She thanked Ellen and asked almost casually, Ellen, you were in the kitchen last night, I believe. Did you happen to see anyone near the library before Miss Cecilia's scream? Ellen's face flushed, and she glanced nervously at the door. No, madam, she said quickly. I was with cook preparing the trays. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes kind but piercing. Of course, my dear, but you seem troubled. If there's anything you know, it's best to share it now. Ellen hesitated, then shook her head. There's nothing, madam, truly. As the maid hurried away, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the growing web of lies. Cecilia's quarrel, Evelyn's fear, Ellen's nervousness, all pointed to secrets within the household. The letter to Charles Vernon suggested a motive tied to a will, and the blue thread hinted at a physical clue that could narrow the suspects. The Colonel's watch, she was certain, was a distraction, but the truth was beginning to emerge, like a picture forming in a fog. "Arthur," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we are close to something. The lies are surfacing, and with them, the truth." Arthur's eyes widened. "You think you know who did it, Jane?" "Not yet," she replied, "but the pattern is forming. In St. Mary Mead, I once found a liar by the way she avoided my eyes. Here, I believe, the truth will be found in what is not said." As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple knew the next step was critical. The household was unraveling, and the killer was among them, watching, waiting. She would need to tread carefully to expose the truth without alerting the culprit. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The late afternoon at Ashwood Grange was cloaked in a sombre hush, the grandeur of the estate dimmed by the weight of Lawrence Mortimer's murder. The drawing-room, where the household had gathered once more, felt stifling despite its high ceilings and wide windows. Miss Jane Marple sat in her familiar armchair, her knitting needles idle for once, her sharp eyes moving over the assembled company. The revelations of the morning, the Colonel's watch, the blue thread, the letter to Charles Vernon had deepened the mystery, and the air was thick with unspoken accusations. Yet Miss Marple sensed that the truth was close, teetering on the edge of revelation, like a vase about to tip. Arthur Bantry, seated beside her, was unusually subdued, his usual chatter replaced by a nervous fidgeting. "Jane," he whispered, "this business is getting to everyone. Did you see Cecilia's face when Grayson mentioned the will?" She looked ready to bolt. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind alert. "Grief can mask many things, Arthur," she replied softly, "but I believe we are approaching a moment of truth. In St. Mary Mead, I once saw a young woman confess to a theft when pressed with just the right question. Here, I think someone is close to breaking." The room's tension was palpable, each member of the household seeming to guard their own secrets. Cecilia sat by the fire, her blue shawl draped over her shoulders, her eyes red-rimmed but guarded. Evelyn Harcourt, beside her, twisted her handkerchief, her face pale with strain. Colonel Harcourt stood by the window, his military bearing rigid, as though bracing for an attack. Gerald Harcourt, ever silent, sat in a corner, his fingers adjusting his cuffs in a nervous tick. Clara Winthrop, her sharp eyes gleaming, watched the room like a predator sizing up its prey. Inspector Grayson, who had been conferring with Sir Henry Clithering in the hall, re-entered with a purposeful stride. "I've had further word from London," he announced, his voice commanding attention. "Charles Vernon has provided a statement. The will Mr. Mortimer was concerned about belongs to Mrs. Evelyn Harcourt's late first husband, Mr. Reginald Ashworth. It seems there was a dispute over a codicil that could affect the inheritance of Ashwood Grange itself." A gasp escaped Evelyn, and all eyes turned to her. "Reginald's will?" she said, her voice trembling. "But that was settled years ago. Grange came to me, and then to Cecilia upon my death. Lawrence had nothing to do with it." Grayson's eyes narrowed. According to Vernon, Mortimer believed the codicil was fraudulent. He was preparing to challenge it, which could have altered the inheritance. "Did you know of this, Mrs. Harcourt?" Evelyn's hands shook, and she shook her head vehemently. "No, I swear it. Lawrence never mentioned it to me. I thought the matter was closed." Miss Marple observed Evelyn closely, noting the genuine shock in her eyes, but also a flicker of something else. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. The codicil was a new piece of the puzzle, one that tied the murder to the heart of the Harcourt family. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a disputed inheritance had led to bitter resentment, though not to violence. Here, the stakes were higher, and the codicil suggested a motive that could implicate anyone with a claim to the Grange. Grayson turned to Cecilia. "Miss Harcourt, as the beneficiary, you stand to gain the most. Did Mortimer discuss this codicil with you?" Cecilia's face flushed, and she rose abruptly, her shawl falling to the floor. "No!" she cried, her voice breaking. "Lawrence never spoke of it. We were planning our wedding, our future. Why would he care about some old will?" Her outburst drew every eye, and Miss Marple noted the way her hands trembled, the way her voice caught on the word future. It was a moment of raw emotion, and Miss Marple knew such moments often revealed truths that careful words concealed. Cecilia's denial was fierce, but there was a desperation in it that suggested she knew more than she admitted. Sir Henry, ever perceptive, stepped forward. "Miss Harcourt," he said gently, "if there's anything you know, it's best to tell us now. The truth will come out, one way or another." Cecilia's eyes filled with tears, and she sank back into her chair, covering her face with her hands. I can't," she whispered. "It's too much." Evelyn moved to her side, her own distress evident. "Cecilia, my dear, what is it? You must tell us." The room held its breath, and Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on Cecilia. This, she thought, was the turning point, the moment when a crack in the facade might reveal the truth. In St. Mary Mead, she had once seen a young man break down under gentle questioning, admitting to a lie that had protected a friend. Cecilia, she sensed, was on the verge of such a confession. After a long pause, Cecilia spoke, her voice barely audible. "Lawrence and I, we argued last night. Not about the will, but about something else. He wanted to postpone the wedding. He said there were complications, things he couldn't explain. I was angry, so angry. I told him I wouldn't wait forever." The admission hung in the air, a revelation that shifted the room's dynamics. Colonel Harcourt's face darkened, and he took a step toward Cecilia. "You argued with him? Why didn't you say so before?" "I was ashamed," Cecilia said, her voice breaking. "I thought it would make me look guilty. But I didn't kill him. I swear it." Grayson's pencil scratched furiously in his notebook. "What time was this argument, Miss Harcourt?" "Just before dinner," Cecilia said. "Around 7:30, in the hall near the library. I went upstairs afterward, and I didn't see him again until I found him." Miss Marple's mind raced. Cecilia's admission confirmed Evelyn's earlier account of overhearing an argument, but it also raised new questions. If Lawrence wanted to postpone the wedding, was it because of the codicil, or something more personal? And why had he been so secretive? She glanced at the shawl on the floor, its blue fabric catching the light. The thread from the library window was a nagging detail, and Cecilia's shawl was a possible match. Yet Evelyn's dress and Parsons's tie remained possibilities, and Miss Marple knew better than to fixate on one clue. The truth, she thought, lay in the interplay of motives and opportunities. Clara Winthrop, ever eager to stir the pot, spoke up. "Well, that's a fine thing, Cecilia. Quarrelling with your fiancé hours before he's murdered. If you ask me, you've got some explaining to do." "Clara, please," Evelyn said, her voice sharp. "This is difficult enough." Miss Marple observed Clara's satisfaction, her sharp eyes gleaming with something akin to triumph. Clara's needling, she thought, was not merely spiteful. It was calculated, perhaps to deflect attention from herself. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a woman who accused others to hide her own misdeeds. Was Clara playing a similar game? Sir Henry, sensing the need to regain control, addressed the group. This new information is significant, but we mustn't jump to conclusions. Miss Marple, have you any observations to share? Miss Marple set her knitting bag aside, her voice calm but authoritative. Only that Cecilia's honesty is a step toward the truth, she said. The argument suggests Lawrence was troubled, perhaps by this codicil or something else. The blue thread, the untouched brandy, the watch, these are pieces of a puzzle, and we must fit them together with care. In St. Mary Mead, I once learned the truth of a crime by listening to what was not said. Here, I believe the silences are as telling as the words. Grayson's expression was sceptical, but he nodded. We'll follow up on the codicil and the argument. Miss Harcourt, you'll need to provide a detailed statement. As Cecilia nodded, her tears falling freely, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the next step. The codicil was a motive, but it was not the only one. Lawrence's secrecy, Cecilia's argument, the blue thread, all pointed to a web of deceit within the household. Someone had acted to protect a secret, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. "Arthur," she whispered, "I should like to speak with Ellen, the housemaid, again. Her nervousness intrigues me." Arthur's eyes widened. "You think the maid's involved?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple replied, "but she knows something. And in a house like this, the servants see more than we realize." As the household dispersed, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty. The emotional crack in Cecilia's facade had revealed a glimpse of the truth, but there was more to uncover. The tapestry of Ashwood Grange was unraveling, and she was ready to pull the next thread. Chapter 9. The Trap. The evening shadows lengthened across Ashwood Grange, the grand estate's elegance now tinged with an air of foreboding. The drawing-room, where the household had gathered once more, was lit by the soft glow of lamps, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill of suspicion that hung over the group. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual armchair, her knitting bag at her side, though her needles remained untouched. Her eyes, sharp and observant behind her spectacles, moved from one face to another, noting the subtle signs of strain. Cecilia's tense posture, Evelyn's nervous hands, Colonel Harcourt's clenched jaw. Cecilia's emotional confession about her argument with Lawrence Mortimer had cracked the facade of the household, and Miss Marple sensed that the time was ripe to apply pressure, to set a trap that might force the truth into the open. Arthur Bantry, ever her faithful companion, leaned closer, his voice a whisper. "Jane, you've got that look again. Are you planning something?" Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "Merely an experiment, Arthur," she replied softly. "In St. Mary Mead, I once caught a thief by suggesting I had seen more than I had. The guilty, you see, often betray themselves when they fear discovery." Before Arthur could press further, Inspector Grayson entered, accompanied by Sir Henry Clithering. The inspector's face was set in a grim line, his notebook tucked under his arm. "I've spoken with Charles Vernon by telephone," he announced, his voice commanding the room's attention. "He confirms that Lawrence Mortimer was investigating a codicil to Reginald Ashworth's will, which could disinherit Cecilia Harcourt in favour of another party. Vernon believes Mortimer was close to proving the codicil was forged." A murmur rippled through the room. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Forged?" she said, her voice trembling. But who would do such a thing? That's what we're here to find out, Grayson said, his eyes scanning the group. The codicil names Mrs. Clara Winthrop as the alternate beneficiary. Mrs. Winthrop, did you know of this? Clara's sharp features tightened, and she sat up straighter, her eyes flashing. I most certainly did not, she snapped. Reginald was my cousin by marriage, and I knew nothing of any codicil. If you're suggesting I had something to do with Lawrence's death, you're barking up the wrong tree. Miss Marple observed Clara closely, noting the indignation in her voice, but also a flicker of unease in her eyes. Clara's denial was vehement, but it was the kind of vehemence that could mask guilt or fear. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once seen a woman protest her innocence with similar fervour, only to confess when confronted with evidence. Grayson turned to Cecilia. Miss Harcourt, you stand to lose the most if the codicil is upheld. Your argument with Mortimer, did it concern this matter? Cecilia's face paled, and she shook her head. No, I told you, it was about the wedding. Lawrence wanted to postpone it, and I was upset. I knew nothing about the codicil until now. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Cecilia's denial was consistent, but her earlier hesitation suggested she was withholding something. The blue thread found on the library window frame, matching her shawl, was a nagging detail, as was Evelyn's blue dress and Parsons's tie. The trap, Miss Marple thought, must be set carefully to catch the right culprit. Sir Henry, sensing the need to move the investigation forward, spoke up. Inspector, perhaps we might gather everyone in the library. A reconstruction of the scene could clarify the timeline and movements. Grayson nodded, though his expression was sceptical. Very well. Everyone, to the library, please. We'll walk through the events of last night. The household rose, their movements reluctant, and followed Grayson and Sir Henry to the library. Miss Marple walked beside Arthur, her mind racing. The library was the key, she was certain. The overturned chair, the untouched brandy, the scattered papers, the blue thread. Each was a clue, and together they formed a pattern that was almost complete. In the library, Grayson positioned everyone according to their stated alibis. Miss Harcourt, he said, you entered at 9 o'clock and found Mr. Mortimer dead. Show us where you stood. Cecilia, trembling slightly, moved to the centre of the room, near the spot where Lawrence's body had lain. I came in here, she said, her voice unsteady, and saw him, there. She pointed to the rug, her eyes averted. Grayson nodded, then turned to the others. Colonel Harcourt, you were in the billiard room. Mrs. Harcourt in your sitting room. Mr. Gerald Harcourt in the conservatory. Mrs. Winthrop in the morning room. Parsons in the pantry, correct? A chorus of affirmations followed, though Miss Marple noted the varying degrees of conviction. Gerald's voice was barely audible, and Parsons's eyes darted nervously towards Cecilia. The trap, she thought, was ready to be sprung. Inspector, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but carrying the weight of authority. If I may, I should like to suggest a possibility. The brandy glass, poured but untouched, suggests Mr. Mortimer was not alone before his death. Suppose someone was with him, someone who entered through the window, perhaps, leaving the blue thread behind. Grayson's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. Go on, Miss Marple. She stepped forward, her small figure commanding the room's attention. Let us consider the timeline. Parsons heard a door close at 8:30. yet everyone claims to have been elsewhere. The letter to Charles Vernon was interrupted, the ink smudged, suggesting a sudden intrusion. The watch, found so conveniently outside, points to Colonel Harcourt, but its placement is too perfect, too staged. I propose that someone in this room was in the library before Cecilia, someone who poured the brandy, perhaps to distract Lawrence, and then struck when his guard was down. The room was silent, every eye fixed on Miss Marple. Cecilia's breath caught, and Evelyn's hands twisted her handkerchief. Colonel Harcourt's face was a mask of fury, while Gerald's eyes remained fixed on the floor. Clara, however, leaned forward, her expression one of barely concealed alarm. "That's a bold claim, Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice sharp. "Are you accusing one of us?" "Not accusing," Miss Marple replied, her tone serene. "Merely observing, but let us test the theory. Inspector, might we ask each person to show us their movements before 9 o'clock? And perhaps examine their clothing for a missing thread?" Grayson hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. Let's start with Miss Harcourt. Show us your movements from 7:30, when you argued with Mortimer." Cecilia rose, her shawl clutched tightly. "I was in the hall, arguing with Lawrence," she said, moving toward the door. "Then I went upstairs to my room, fetched my shawl, and came down at 9 to the library." Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes on the shawl. "May I see it, my dear?" she asked gently. Cecilia hesitated, then handed it over. Miss Marple examined it closely, noting a small tear near the edge, where a thread could have been caught. "Most interesting," she murmured. "Inspector, this tear matches the thread found on the window frame." Cecilia's face went white. I didn't go near the window," she cried. "I swear it." Grayson's eyes narrowed, but before he could speak, Evelyn stood, her voice trembling. "Wait! Cecilia couldn't have done it! I was in the library at 8:30. I didn't tell you because I was afraid. Lawrence and I spoke briefly, about the wedding, not the codicil. I left him alive, I swear." The room erupted in murmurs, and Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The trap had worked. Evelyn's confession had cracked the surface, revealing a new layer of the truth. But was it the whole truth? The blue thread, the brandy, the watch, all pointed to a carefully staged crime, and Miss Marple suspected there was more to uncover. "Mrs. Harcourt," she said gently, "why did you not mention this before?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "I was afraid it would look suspicious, and I heard someone outside the library as I left. A rustle, like someone in the bushes." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Evelyn's admission placed her in the library, but the rustle suggested another presence. The blue thread, she thought, might belong to someone else entirely. Perhaps Parsons, whose tie was a similar shade, or even Clara, whose coat she had seen earlier. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, "I suggest we examine Parsons's tie and Mrs. Winthrop's coat, and perhaps ask Ellen, the housemaid, what she saw last night. Servants, you know, often see more than we realize." Grayson nodded, his skepticism giving way to curiosity. "Very well, Miss Marple. Let's see where this leads." As the household waited, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty. The trap had been set, and the truth was close. The killer was in the room, watching, and she was determined to catch them before they could slip away. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The library at Ashwood Grange was bathed in the dim glow of lamplight. the heavy curtains drawn against the evening chill. The household stood or sat in a tense semicircle, their faces a study in apprehension and defiance. Miss Jane Marple, her small figure unassuming yet commanding, stood near the desk where Lawrence Mortimer had met his end. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, but her hands were still, her sharp eyes moving from one suspect to another. The trap she had set in the previous gathering had borne fruit. Evelyn's confession had cracked the household's facade, and now Miss Marple knew the time had come to unravel the mystery of Lawrence's murder. Inspector Grayson, his notebook at the ready, stood beside Sir Henry Clithering, whose calm authority lent weight to the proceedings. Arthur Bantry, ever loyal, hovered near Miss Marple, his expression a mix of awe and anticipation. "Jane," he whispered, "are you really going to solve it now?" Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "The truth, Arthur, is like a tapestry," she replied softly. "We have gathered the threads, and now we must weave them into a picture." She turned to the group, her voice gentle but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached a moment of clarity. Lawrence Mortimer's death was no random act, but a carefully planned murder, concealed by clever misdirection. Let us reconstruct the events step by step and see where the truth lies." The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. Cecilia Harcourt clutched her blue shawl, her face pale. Evelyn's hands twisted her handkerchief, her eyes darting nervously. Colonel Harcourt stood rigid, his moustache twitching with impatience. Gerald Harcourt, as ever, was silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. Clara Winthrop's sharp eyes gleamed with a mix of curiosity and unease. Parsons, the butler, stood by the door, his expression impassive, but his posture tense. Miss Marple began, her tone measured. Lawrence Mortimer was killed at approximately 9 o'clock, stabbed with a letter opener bearing the Harcourt crest. The scene was staged to suggest an intruder. The open window, the Colonel's watch found in the shrubbery, the blue thread caught on the sill. Yet these clues, so carefully placed, are too perfect, too theatrical. In St. Mary Mead, I once saw a theft disguised as a burglary, with a broken window and a planted glove. Here, the watch and thread serve the same purpose, to mislead. She paused, her eyes on Colonel Harcourt. "The watch, Colonel, was yours, yet you claim it was lost days ago. I believe you. Its discovery outside the library was meant to incriminate you, but it was placed too deliberately, caught in the bushes where it would be found. The true killer wanted us to look at you, not at them." The Colonel's face reddened, but he nodded. "I told you, I had nothing to do with it." Miss Marple turned to Cecilia. "Miss Harcourt, your discovery of the body at 9 o'clock was the catalyst for our investigation. You admitted to arguing with Lawrence at 7:30 about postponing the wedding. Your shawl, blue and torn, matches the thread found on the window. Yet I do not believe you are the killer. Your grief, though guarded, is genuine, and your hesitation suggests fear, not guilt." Cecilia's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, clutching her shawl. "I loved him," she whispered. "I could never hurt him." Miss Marple's gaze moved to Evelyn. "Mrs. Harcourt, you confessed to being in the library at 8:30, speaking with Lawrence about the wedding. You heard a rustle outside as you left, suggesting someone was watching. Your dress last night was blue, another possible source of the thread. But your confession, I believe, was truthful. You were afraid, not of guilt, but of what Lawrence's investigation into the codicil might reveal. Evelyn's face crumpled, and she nodded. I didn't know about the codicil, but I feared Lawrence was stirring up trouble. Reginald's will, it's been a shadow over this family. Miss Marple nodded, then turned to Clara Winthrop. Mrs. Winthrop, you were named in the codicil as a potential beneficiary. Your sharp tongue and quick accusations have kept suspicion on others, first the Colonel, then Parsons. Yet your coat, also blue, could have left that thread. Your eagerness to deflect suggests you know more than you've said. Clara's eyes flashed. I won't be accused by an old spinster. I was in the morning room, reading. I had no reason to kill Lawrence. Miss Marple's expression remained serene. Perhaps not, but let us consider another possibility. She turned to Gerald Harcourt, whose silence had been a constant presence. Mr. Gerald Harcourt, you claim to have been in the conservatory, tending your orchids at 9 o'clock, yet your cuffs, which you adjust so nervously, are blue, and a thread from them could match the one on the window. You are a man of few words, but your silence speaks volumes. Gerald's head snapped up, his eyes wide. I was in the conservatory, he stammered. I had no quarrel with Lawrence. Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice calm but relentless. Let us return to the library. The brandy, poured but untouched, suggests Lawrence was not alone. The letter to Charles Vernon, interrupted by a smudged ink blot, indicates a sudden intrusion. The thread on the window and the watch outside suggest an attempt to stage an outsider's entry. But the true clue lies in the timing. Parsons heard a door close at 8:30, just as Evelyn left the library. Someone was there, watching, waiting. She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. I believe the killer entered the library shortly after Evelyn's departure, perhaps through the window to avoid detection. They poured the brandy to put Lawrence at ease, then struck with the letter opener when his back was turned. The watch was planted later, to cast suspicion on the Colonel. The thread, however, was a mistake, a small detail that betrays the killer. She turned to Parsons, who stood rigid by the door. Parsons, you found the watch, and your tie is blue. You heard a door close at 8:30, yet you claimed to be in the pantry. I believe you were near the library, perhaps in the corridor, and saw something or someone you have not admitted. Parsons's face paled, and he shook his head. I was in the pantry, madam. I swear it. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a servant who saw more than he admitted, fearing for his position. You know something, Parsons, and now is the time to speak. The butler's composure cracked, and he sank into a chair, his hands trembling. I saw Mr. Gerald near the library at 8:30, he said, his voice low. He was coming from the conservatory, but he paused by the library door. I thought nothing of it at the time, but he looked agitated. All eyes turned to Gerald, whose face had gone ashen. That's a lie, he cried, rising to his feet. I was in the conservatory all evening. Miss Marple shook her head gently. Mr. Harcourt, your silence has been your shield, but it cannot protect you now. The codicil to Reginald Ashworth's will threatened Cecilia's inheritance, but it also affected you. As Colonel Harcourt's brother, you have lived in his shadow, dependent on his generosity. Lawrence's investigation into the codicil would have exposed its forgery. A forgery you arranged to secure a share of the Grange for yourself. Gerald's eyes widened, and he took a step back, his hands shaking. "You have no proof," Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "The blue thread came from your cuff, caught when you climbed through the window to avoid the corridor. You poured the brandy to distract Lawrence, then stabbed him with the letter opener, a weapon close at hand. You planted the Colonel's watch to cast suspicion on him, knowing his temper made him an easy target. But you could not foresee the thread, nor Parsons's observation of your presence near the library." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over the group. Gerald's face contorted, and he sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. I didn't mean to," he whispered. "Lawrence found out about the codicil. He was going to ruin everything. I only wanted to protect my future." Grayson stepped forward, his handcuffs at the ready. "Gerald Harcourt, you're under arrest for the murder of Lawrence Mortimer." As Gerald was led away, Cecilia sobbed, and Evelyn clutched her hand. Colonel Harcourt's face was a mask of shock, while Clara's eyes gleamed with a mix of triumph and unease. Miss Marple stood quietly, her expression serene, but her heart heavy with the cost of truth. "Jane," Arthur whispered, "you've done it again." "Not I, Arthur," she replied softly. "The truth did it, as it always does." Chapter 11. The Reflection. The library at Ashwood Grange, so recently the scene of a grim revelation, now lay quiet, its heavy curtains drawn back to let in the pale morning light. The air was still, the scent of old books and wax polish mingling with the faint chill of autumn. Miss Jane Marple stood by the window, her small figure framed against the glass, her eyes tracing the outline of the laurel bushes where Colonel Harcourt's watch had been found. The arrest of Gerald Harcourt the previous evening had brought the mystery of Lawrence Mortimer's murder to a close, yet the weight of the truth lingered. A sombre note in the otherwise elegant surroundings. Arthur Bantry, seated in a chair near the fireplace, adjusted his spectacles, his face a mix of admiration and bewilderment. "Jane," he said, his voice low, "I still can't quite believe it. Gerald, of all people! So quiet, so unassuming. How did you know?" Miss Marple turned from the window, her expression serene but tinged with melancholy. "It was not a matter of knowing, Arthur," she replied softly, "but of seeing. In St. Mary Mead, I have often observed that the quietest people carry the deepest secrets. Gerald's silence was not shyness, but a shield, and his nervous habits, those cuffs he adjusted so often, betrayed his unease." She moved to the desk where Lawrence's body had lain, her fingers brushing lightly over the surface. "The clues were there, you see. The blue thread, the untouched brandy, the interrupted letter. Each was a thread in a tapestry, and together they pointed to Gerald. His motive, the forged codicil, was one of greed and desperation, a desire to secure a future he felt was slipping away." Arthur shook his head, marvelling, and the watch, planting it to frame the Colonel. That was clever, in a twisted sort of way. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "But cleverness is often the undoing of the guilty. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a man who hid stolen goods in his neighbour's shed, thinking it would deflect suspicion. Gerald's mistake was similar. He underestimated the power of small details." The door opened, and Sir Henry Clithering entered, his face bearing the satisfied air of a man who had seen justice done. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm with respect, You've outdone yourself. Grayson's still reeling from your performance last night. He's taking Gerald to the station now, and the case is all but closed." Miss Marple smiled faintly, settling into an armchair. "I am glad to have been of some small assistance, Sir Henry. But it is the truth that solves crimes, not I. My part is merely to listen and observe." Sir Henry chuckled, taking a seat opposite her. "You're too modest. That business with the thread, matching it to Gerald's cuff, was brilliant. And getting Parsons to admit he saw Gerald near the library, masterful." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Parsons was the key, you see. Servants often know more than they say, for they move through a house unnoticed. In St. Mary Mead, a maid once revealed a theft by mentioning a single misplaced teacup. Parsons's hesitation told me he was hiding something, and gentle pressure brought it out." Arthur leaned forward, his curiosity unabated. "But Jane, what about Cecilia's shawl and Evelyn's dress? I thought the thread might have come from one of them." "A fair question," Miss Marple replied. "The shawl and dress were possibilities, but the tear in Cecilia's shawl was too recent, and Evelyn's dress showed no signs of fraying. Gerald's cuff, however, had a loose thread I noticed during our first evening here. A small thing, but significant. The thread on the window frame was his undoing. A careless mistake made in his haste to stage the scene." Sir Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And the codicil? Gerald forged it to secure a share of the Grange, knowing Cecilia's inheritance would otherwise leave him with nothing." "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "Greed is a powerful motive, but it often blinds the greedy to their own flaws. Gerald believed his quiet nature would keep him above suspicion, but human nature, you see, is never so tidy." The door opened again, and Evelyn Harcourt entered, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I cannot thank you enough. To think that Gerald, my husband's own brother, I'm still in shock." Miss Marple rose, her manner gentle. "It is a painful truth, Evelyn, but truth is often painful. You and Cecilia will heal in time, and the Grange will be yours to protect." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "Cecilia is devastated, but she's strong. She'll carry on for Lawrence's sake." Miss Marple patted her hand. "She is young, and youth is resilient. In St. Mary Mead, I have seen many recover from such blows, given time and kindness." As Evelyn withdrew, Sir Henry leaned back, his eyes on Miss Marple. "You have a remarkable gift, my dear lady. You see the world as it is, not as it pretends to be." Miss Marple's smile was wistful. "I see only what people reveal, Sir Henry. We all carry our stories, written in our glances, our gestures, our silences. To solve a mystery is merely to read those stories with care." Arthur, unable to contain himself, burst out, "But Jane, how do you do it? You sit there knitting, looking like everyone's favourite aunt, and yet you see through everyone." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "It is because I'm an old woman, Arthur, that I see so much. People forget I am there, and in their forgetting, they show their true selves. In St. Mary Mead, I learned that human nature is the same everywhere, whether in a village or a grand estate like Ashwood Grange." Sir Henry rose, offering his arm. "Come, Miss Marple, let's take a turn in the garden before you leave. The air will do us good after all this." She accepted, and together they stepped into the crisp morning air, Arthur trailing behind. The gardens of Ashwood Grange were serene, the lawns stretching toward the woods, the laurel bushes standing silent witness to the drama that had unfolded. Miss Marple paused by the library window, her eyes on the spot where the watch had been found. "It is a beautiful place," she said softly, "but beauty can hide such darkness. I am glad to have helped bring light to it." Sir Henry nodded. "You've done more than that. You've reminded us all that justice, like truth, requires patience and perception." As they walked on, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to St. Mary Mead, to her quiet cottage and her garden, where life was simpler but no less revealing. She would return there soon to her knitting and her neighbours, but she carried with her the satisfaction of a puzzle solved, a tapestry woven from the threads of human nature. "Arthur," she said, glancing at her friend, "when we return home, do remind me to tell you about the time Mrs. Elspeth's cat led us to a missing locket. It's a story not unlike this one." Arthur laughed, his spirits lifting. "I'll hold you to that, Jane." And so, with the mystery of Ashwood Grange resolved, Miss Marple walked on, her heart light but her mind ever watchful, ready for the next story that human nature might tell. Chapter 12. The Aftermath. The morning mist clung to the lawns of Ashwood Grange, softening the sharp edges of the Georgian estate, and lending an air of quiet melancholy to the scene. The household, still reeling from the revelation of Gerald Harcourt's guilt, moved through the day with a subdued air, their voices hushed, their movements careful, as though the very walls might hold more secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, a small sunlit space overlooking the rose garden, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on her pale blue shawl. The resolution of Lawrence Mortimer's murder had brought justice, but Miss Marple knew that justice, while necessary, often left wounds that took time to heal. Arthur Bantry, seated across from her with a cup of tea, was uncharacteristically quiet, his usual ebullience tempered by the events of the past days. "Jane," he said at last, breaking the silence, "it's all over now, isn't it? Gerald's in custody, and the Grange can go back to normal, yet it doesn't feel finished somehow." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, met his with a gentle understanding. "It is never truly finished, Arthur," she replied softly. "A crime, once committed, leaves echoes. In St. Mary Mead, I have seen families torn apart by lesser betrayals than this, but time and kindness can mend much." Her thoughts drifted to the household. Cecilia, grappling with the loss of her fiancé and the betrayal of her step-uncle. Evelyn, burdened by the knowledge that her late husband's will had sparked such violence. Colonel Harcourt, whose stern exterior hid a deep sense of failure for not seeing his brother's desperation. Even Clara Winthrop, with her sharp tongue, seemed subdued, her usual barb softened by the weight of the truth. The door opened, and Sir Henry Clithering entered, his face bearing the calm authority of a man accustomed to tying up loose ends. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm, "I've just spoken with Inspector Grayson. Gerald has made a full confession. He forged the codicil to secure a share of the Grange, fearing he'd be left with nothing once Cecilia inherited. When Lawrence began investigating, Gerald panicked and acted in haste." Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing. "It is as I thought. Greed is a powerful motive, but it often blinds one to reason. Gerald believed he could outwit us all, but the smallest details, the thread, the watch, betrayed him." Arthur leaned forward, His curiosity piqued. "But Jane, how did you know it was Gerald, and not Cecilia or Evelyn? That blue thread could have come from any of them." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "The thread was a clue, Arthur, but not the only one. Cecilia's grief was genuine, though guarded, and Evelyn's fear stemmed from her concern for her stepdaughter, not guilt. Gerald, however, was too silent, too careful. His nervous habit of adjusting his cuffs drew my eye, and when I saw the loose thread, I began to suspect. In St. Mary Mead, I once caught a poacher because of a torn jacket. Small things, you see, tell great stories." Sir Henry chuckled, settling into a chair. "You're a marvel, Miss Marple. Grayson's singing your praises, though he'll never admit it. He's convinced you've got second sight." "Not at all," Miss Marple said, her tone demure. "I merely observe human nature. People are much the same, whether in a village or a grand house like this. Their fears, their desires, their mistakes, they leave traces, if one knows where to look." The door opened again, and Evelyn Harcourt entered, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice steady despite the strain in her eyes, "I owe you a great debt. You've saved us from a shadow that might have hung over us forever. Cecilia is resting now, but she asked me to thank you." Miss Marple set her knitting, aside, her expression kind. "There is no debt, Evelyn. I am glad to have helped bring clarity. Cecilia is young, and she will find her way forward with your support." Evelyn nodded, her eyes glistening. "I hope so. The codicil, it's been destroyed, as it should have been. The Grange will pass to Cecilia, as Reginald intended, but the pain of Gerald's betrayal, it will take time to heal." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "Time, my dear, is a great healer. In St. Mary Mead, I have seen families mend after far worse. You and Cecilia have strength, and you have each other." As Evelyn withdrew, Sir Henry leaned forward, his eyes thoughtful. "What will you do now, Miss Marple?" "Back to St. Mary Mead, I presume." "Indeed," she replied, her smile wistful. "My garden needs tending, and my neighbours will be eager for news, though I shall tell them little. Gossip, you know, can be as dangerous as a lie." Arthur laughed, his spirits lifting. "You'll have them eating out of your hand, Jane, spinning tales of Ashwood Grange without giving away a thing." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A story is best when it is half told, Arthur. Let them imagine the rest." Sir Henry rose, offering his arm. "Come, let's take one last turn in the garden before you leave. The roses are in bloom, and I'd wager they've a few secrets of their own." Miss Marple accepted, and together they stepped into the cool morning air, Arthur trailing behind. The gardens of Ashwood Grange were a riot of colour. The roses nodding in the breeze, their petals a stark contrast to the darkness that had unfolded within the house. Miss Marple paused by a particularly vibrant bloom, her fingers brushing its petals lightly. "Beauty and tragedy," she murmured, almost to herself. "They often walk hand in hand, but it is the truth that brings balance." Sir Henry nodded, his expression one of respect. "You've brought balance here, Miss Marple. The Grange will recover, thanks to you." As they walked on, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the journey ahead, to the train that would carry her back to St. Mary Mead, to the quiet routines of her cottage, where life was simpler but no less revealing. The mystery of Ashwood Grange had been solved, but she knew there would always be another puzzle, another story waiting to be read in the glances and silences of those around her. "Arthur," she said, glancing at her friend, "when we return, do remind me to check on Mrs. Elspeth's cat. It has a habit of wandering, and I suspect it knows more than it lets on." Arthur chuckled, his spirits fully restored. "I'll do that, Jane, and I'll be ready for your next adventure." Miss Marple smiled, her heart light but her mind ever watchful. The world, she knew, was full of mysteries, and she would be ready for them, armed with nothing more than her keen eye and her understanding of human nature. Chapter 13. The Lingering Shadows. The afternoon. Sun cast a golden glow over Ashwood Grange, softening the stark lines of the Georgian estate and bathing the gardens in a warm, forgiving light. Yet, despite the beauty of the day, a sense of unease lingered, as though the house itself mourned the betrayal that had unfolded within its walls. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, the pale blue shawl taking shape in her lap. The arrest of Gerald Harcourt had brought closure to the mystery of Lawrence Mortimer's murder. But Miss Marple knew that some wounds, like those of the heart, healed more slowly than others. Arthur Bantry, seated opposite her with a newspaper he wasn't reading, fidgeted with his spectacles, his face reflecting a mix of relief and lingering disquiet. "Jane," he said at last, breaking the silence, "it's all settled now, isn't it? Gerald's confessed. The police are satisfied, and yet I can't shake the feeling that there's something more to this." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, met his with a gentle understanding. "You are not wrong, Arthur," she replied softly. "A crime, once solved, does not erase its ripples. In St. Mary Mead, I've seen how a single act of deceit can unsettle a village for years. Here, at Ashwood Grange, the echoes of Gerald's actions will linger, but they will fade in time." Her thoughts drifted to the household. Cecilia, grappling with the loss of her fiancé and the betrayal of her step-uncle. Evelyn, burdened by the weight of a family torn apart. Colonel Harcourt, whose stern demeanour masked a deep sense of failure. Even Clara Winthrop, with her sharp tongue, had been unusually subdued, as though the revelation of Gerald's guilt had stripped her of her usual bravado. The door opened, and Cecilia Harcourt entered, her face pale but composed, her auburn hair neatly pinned, though her eyes still bore the redness of recent tears. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice steady but soft, "I wanted to thank you again. Without you, we might never have known the truth. It's a bitter truth, but it's better than living in the dark." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression kind. "My dear, I am glad to have helped, though I wish the truth had been kinder. You have strength, Cecilia, and you will find your way forward." Cecilia nodded, her lips trembling slightly. "I thought Lawrence was my future, but now I don't know what to think. He was investigating the codicil, wasn't he? Trying to protect me." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "I believe so. Lawrence's letter to Charles Vernon suggests he suspected the codicil was forged, which would have secured your inheritance. His intentions were honourable, but they stirred a nest of vipers." Cecilia's eyes filled with tears, and she clutched her shawl, the blue one that had briefly cast suspicion on her. "I wish I'd known. We argued that night, and I was so angry. If I'd understood what he was doing." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "Regret is a heavy burden, my dear, but it is not yours to carry. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a young woman who blamed herself for a friend's misfortune, only to learn that forgiveness begins with oneself. You loved Lawrence, and that is enough. As Cecilia withdrew, her steps slow but resolute, Arthur leaned forward, his curiosity undimmed. Jane, do you think there's more to the codicil? Something we've missed? Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, the soft click a counterpoint to her thoughts. The codicil was the spark, Arthur, but it was Gerald's desperation that lit the fire. His confession confirms he forged it to secure a share of the Grange, fearing he'd be left with nothing. Yet I wonder, there may be others who knew of his plans or at least suspected them. Her thoughts turned to Clara Winthrop, whose sharp accusations had deflected suspicion from herself. Clara's knowledge of the household's dynamics, her quickness to point fingers at the Colonel and Parsons, suggested a deeper awareness of the tensions at play. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known a woman much like Clara, whose gossip masked a keen understanding of her neighbours' secrets. Was Clara merely observant, or had she played a role in the shadows? Sir Henry Clithering entered, his presence a welcome interruption. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm with admiration. "Grayson's wrapping up the paperwork, and Gerald will be transferred to London tomorrow. You've given us quite a tale to tell at Scotland Yard." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I am merely an observer, Sir Henry. The truth was there, waiting to be seen. The blue thread, the watch, the brandy. They were signposts, pointing to Gerald's guilt." Sir Henry settled into a chair, his eyes thoughtful. "And yet you saw what we missed. That thread, for instance. How did you know it was from Gerald's cuff, and not Cecilia's shawl?" "It was a matter of elimination," Miss Marple replied. "Cecilia's shawl had a tear, but it was too fresh, likely for her distress after finding Lawrence. Evelyn's dress showed no signs of fraying. Parsons's tie was a possibility, but his manner suggested fear, not guilt. Gerald's cuffs, however, were worn, and I noticed a loose thread on our first evening here. It was a small thing, but in St. Mary Mead I once found a thief because of a single frayed sleeve." Arthur chuckled, shaking his head. "You make it sound so simple, Jane. But what about the brandy? Why pour it and not drink it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "That, Arthur, was Gerald's attempt to create a scene of calm. He poured the brandy to put Lawrence at ease, perhaps to distract him while he reached for the letter opener. But Lawrence, focused on his letter, did not drink. The untouched glass was a clue to the killer's presence, a moment of miscalculation." Sir Henry nodded, his respect evident. "You've a gift, Miss Marple, for seeing the human side of these things. Gerald's desperation, Cecilia's grief, Evelyn's fear. You understood them all." "Human nature is my study, Sir Henry," she said softly. "It is the same in St. Mary Mead as it is here. People act from love, fear, greed, and their actions leave traces, if one knows where to look." As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple and Arthur prepared to leave Ashwood Grange. Their bags were packed, and a car was waiting to take them to the station. Evelyn and Cecilia saw them off, their gratitude tinged with sorrow. Colonel Harcourt, his face stern but softened, shook Miss Marple's hand with a gruff word of thanks. Clara Winthrop, standing apart, offered a curt nod, her sharp eyes betraying a flicker of unease that Miss Marple noted but did not pursue. As the car wound through the wooded lanes toward the village, Arthur leaned back, his expression reflective. "Jane, do you think the Grange will ever be the same?" "No," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "But it will heal, in its way. Families are resilient, Arthur, and the truth, though painful, sets them free to mend." He smiled, his spirits lifting. "You're a wonder, Jane. What's next? Back to St. Mary Mead for a bit of peace?" "For now," she replied, her eyes on the passing countryside. "But life, you know, has a way of presenting new puzzles. I shall be ready for them, with my knitting and my garden to keep me company." The car rolled on, carrying Miss Marple away from the shadows of Ashwood Grange, toward the quiet familiarity of St. Mary Mead, where the world was smaller but no less revealing, and where she would wait, ever watchful, for the next story human nature had to tell. Chapter 14. The Final Threads. The train to St. Mary Mead rattled gently through the countryside, its rhythmic clatter a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil that had unfolded at Ashwood Grange. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting bag at her side, the pale blue shawl nearly complete in her lap. The golden hues of late summer fields passed by, but her thoughts lingered on the events of the past days. The murder of Lawrence Mortimer, the betrayal of Gerald Harcourt, and the fragile recovery of a family torn apart. The mystery was solved, yet Miss Marple knew that some threads, like those in her knitting, required careful tying off to ensure the pattern held. Arthur Bantry, seated opposite her, adjusted his spectacles and sighed. "Well, Jane," he said, his voice tinged with relief, "it's done. Gerald's confessed, the police are satisfied, and we're on our way home. Yet I can't help feeling we've left something unfinished at the Grange." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, met his with a gentle smile. "You are perceptive, Arthur," she replied softly. "A crime leaves loose ends, like a tapestry not yet framed. In St. Mary Mead, I have seen how a single act of deceit can ripple through a community, and Ashwood Grange will feel those ripples for some time." Her thoughts drifted to the household they had left behind. Cecilia Harcourt, though devastated by Lawrence's death and Gerald's betrayal, had shown a quiet strength that promised resilience. Evelyn, burdened by the weight of her family's secrets, would need to guide her stepdaughter through the healing process. Colonel Harcourt, his pride wounded by his brother's actions, faced the challenge of rebuilding trust. Even Clara Winthrop, with her sharp tongue and sharper eyes, had seemed subdued, as though the revelation had forced her to confront her own role in the family's tensions. Arthur leaned forward, his curiosity undimmed. "Jane, there's something I still don't understand. Clara Winthrop, she was so quick to point fingers, first at the Colonel, then at Parsons. Do you think she knew about Gerald's plan with the codicil?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her expression thoughtful. "Clara is a woman who sees much and says more," she said. "In St. Mary Mead, I knew a lady much like her, whose gossip often masked a deeper knowledge. Clara may not have known the full extent of Gerald's scheme, but her accusations were calculated, perhaps to protect herself, or to stir the pot and see what surfaced. I suspect she sensed the codicil was a source of trouble, though she denied knowledge of it." Arthur frowned, puzzled. But why not speak out if she suspected? "Fear, perhaps," Miss Marple replied. "Or pride. Clara is not a woman who admits weakness easily. Her role in this was not criminal, but her silence allowed the tension to fester. It is a lesson, Arthur, the truth is best served by openness, however painful. The train slowed as it approached a small station, and Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where a group of villagers stood waiting, their lives seemingly untouched by the drama of Ashwood Grange. Yet she knew that every village, every house, held its own secrets, waiting to be uncovered by a keen eye. The door to their compartment slid open, and Sir Henry Clithering stepped in, his face brightening at the sight of Miss Marple. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, settling into a seat. "I was passing through on my way to London and couldn't resist checking in. Grayson sends his regards. He's still marvelling at your work on the case." Miss Marple smiled, her hands resuming their knitting. "You are too kind, Sir Henry. I did only what was necessary, piecing together the clues that were there for all to see. The blue thread, the untouched brandy, the planted watch. They told a story, and I merely read it." Sir Henry chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "You make it sound so simple, but you saw what we missed. That thread on Gerald's cuff. How did you spot it so early?" "It was a small thing," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "On our first evening at the Grange, I noticed Gerald's nervous habit of adjusting his cuffs, and one was frayed, with a loose thread. When we found the blue thread on the window frame, I began to suspect. In St. Mary Mead, I once caught a shoplifter because of a torn glove. The smallest details, Sir Henry, are often the loudest." Arthur laughed, shaking his head. "You're a wonder, Jane. But what about Parsons? He held back about seeing Gerald near the library. Why didn't he speak sooner?" Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. "Parsons is a loyal servant, Arthur, and loyalty can make one hesitate. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a butler who kept silent about a theft to protect his employer's reputation. Parsons feared implicating Gerald, perhaps because he knew the family's dependence on the Colonel's goodwill. But when pressed, he spoke the truth, and that was enough." Sir Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And the codicil? Gerald's confession clarified that he forged it to secure a share of the Grange. But I wonder if there's more to the story. Could someone else have known?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "It is possible, Sir Henry. The household is a web of relationships, and secrets are rarely kept by one person alone. Clara's accusations, Evelyn's fear, even Cecilia's guarded grief. They suggest knowledge, however partial. But Gerald acted alone in the murder, driven by his own desperation. The codicil was his creation, and Lawrence's investigation was his undoing." The train began to move again, the countryside slipping by in a blur of green and gold. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to St. Mary Mead, to her cottage and her garden, where life was quieter but no less revealing. The mystery of Ashwood Grange had been a complex tapestry, woven from greed, fear, and betrayal. But it was the small threads, the thread, the watch, the brandy, that had led her to the truth. "Jane," Arthur said, breaking her reverie, "do you think Cecilia will be all right?" "She's lost so much." "She will heal," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle. "Youth is resilient, and Cecilia has Evelyn's support. In St. Mary Mead, I have seen young hearts mend after great loss. It takes time, but it happens." Sir Henry leaned back, his eyes on the passing landscape. "You've given the Harcourts a chance to rebuild, Miss Marple. That's no small thing." Miss Marple's smile was wistful. "I have only helped them see the truth, Sir Henry. The rest is up to them. Human nature is a curious thing. capable of great darkness, but also of great light. As the train neared St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her heart light, but her mind ever watchful. The Grange was behind her, but she knew the world was full of mysteries, waiting to be unravelled by her quiet observation and her understanding of the human heart. "Arthur," she said, glancing at her friend, "when we arrive, do remind me to check on Mrs. Elspeth's roses. They're prone to aphids, and I suspect they've a story of their own to tell." Arthur chuckled, his spirits fully restored. "I'll do that, Jane, and I'll be ready for your next puzzle." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes on the horizon, where the familiar outlines of St. Mary Mead awaited. The adventure at Ashwood Grange was over, but she was ready for whatever came next, armed with her knitting and her keen eye for the truths that lay hidden in plain sight. Chapter 15. The Quiet Departure. The train pulled into the small station at St. Mary Mead, its whistle piercing the soft hum of the countryside. The platform was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves in the autumn breeze, and the chatter of a few villagers awaiting their own journeys. Miss Jane Marple stepped down from the carriage, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, the pale blue shawl now complete and neatly folded within. The adventure at Ashwood Grange had come to a close, but its echoes lingered in her mind, a reminder of the delicate balance between truth and human frailty. Arthur Bantry, ever her steadfast companion, followed close behind, carrying her small suitcase with a gallant air. "Well, Jane," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "we're back where we belong. No grand estates or murders here, just good old St. Mary Mead. Feels a bit tame after all that, doesn't it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, her lips curving in a faint smile. "Tame, Arthur? Perhaps. But in St. Mary Mead, I have found that even the quietest corners hold their secrets. The village is not so different from Ashwood Grange, you know. Human nature is the same everywhere." They walked along the familiar path from the station, the hedgerows blooming with late summer flowers, the air carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the Grange, to Cecilia Harcourt, whose strength would carry her through grief, to Evelyn, whose kindness would mend the family's wounds, to Colonel Harcourt, whose pride had been tested but not broken. Even Clara Winthrop, with her sharp tongue, had been touched by the tragedy, her accusations silenced by the weight of truth. And Gerald, his greed had been his undoing, a cautionary tale of how desperation could unravel even the most careful plans. Arthur, sensing her reflective mood, broke the silence. "Jane, I've been thinking about Gerald. He seemed so ordinary. How did you know he was capable of murder?" Miss Marple's steps slowed, her voice soft but clear. "It was not a matter of knowing, Arthur, but of seeing. Gerald's silence was his mask, but his actions, the nervous cuffs, the careful alibis, betrayed him. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a quiet man who stole from the church poor box, thinking no one would suspect him because he spoke so little. People, you see, reveal themselves in what they do not say as much as in what they do." Arthur chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a marvel, Jane. That blue thread, the brandy, the watch. You saw it all when the rest of us were stumbling about." "Not stumbling, Arthur," she said gently. "You and Sir Henry and Inspector Grayson were all essential. I merely noticed the small things. The thread caught on the window, the brandy poured but untouched, the watch too conveniently placed. They were like stitches in a pattern, and once I saw the pattern, the truth became clear. They reached Danemid Cottage, its whitewashed walls and tidy garden a welcome sight after the grandeur and turmoil of Ashwood Grange. Lily, Miss Marple's young maid, greeted them at the gate, her face bright with curiosity. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're back!" she exclaimed. "Was it terribly exciting? Were there really lords and ladies and such?" Miss Marple smiled, patting Lily's arm. "Exciting, perhaps, but not so different from here, Lily. People are people, whether in a cottage or a mansion. Now do be a dear and put the kettle on. Mr. Bantry and I could use a cup of tea." As Lily scurried off, Arthur set the suitcase down and turned to Miss Marple, his expression earnest. "Jane, do you think the Harcourts will be all right? Cecilia, especially. She's so young to lose so much." Miss Marple's eyes softened, her gaze drifting to the roses climbing the cottage wall. "Cecilia is stronger than she knows, Arthur. In St. Mary Mead, I have seen young women recover from far worse. Broken engagements, lost loves, even betrayal. With Evelyn's support and time, she will find her way. The Grange will carry its scars, but scars fade." Arthur nodded, his spirits lifting. "You're right, as always. But what about you, Jane? Back to your knitting and your garden? Or is there another mystery waiting around the corner?" Miss Marple's laugh was soft, almost musical. "For now, my garden needs me, and my knitting is never done. But mysteries, Arthur, have a way of finding one, even in a place as quiet as St. Mary Mead." They entered the cottage, where the familiar scent of lavender and beeswax greeted them. Lily had set out a tray with tea and biscuits, and Miss Marple settled into her favourite chair by the window, her knitting bag at her side. Arthur took a seat opposite, his face relaxed for the first time in days. As they sipped their tea, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the lessons of Ashwood Grange. The blue thread, the planted watch, the interrupted letter, they were not just clues, but reminders of the fragility of trust, the weight of greed, and the power of truth. She thought of Gerald, whose quiet desperation had led to murder, and of Cecilia, whose grief would shape her future. Human nature, she mused, was a tapestry of light and shadow, and her role was simply to trace its patterns. "Jane," Arthur said, breaking her reverie, "you promised to tell me about Mrs. Elspeth's cat and the missing locket. Is it as good a story as this one?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, Arthur, it's a small tale, but a telling one. The cat, you see, had a habit of wandering into places it shouldn't, and one day it brought back a clue that solved a mystery. Much like the blue thread, it was a small thing, but it led to the truth." Arthur laughed, leaning back in his chair. "I'll never look at a cat the same way again, or a thread for that matter." Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. The world outside her window was quiet, but she knew it was only a matter of time before another puzzle presented itself. For now, she was content to sit in her cottage, surrounded by the familiar comforts of St. Mary Mead, her mind ever watchful, her heart open to the stories that human nature would inevitably tell. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the village, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The secret of Ashwood Grange was solved, its shadows dispelled, and she was home, ready for whatever mystery might come next.